You ever have one of those moments where you realize the world is not quite what you expected? That everything you've been taught about fairness, talent, or common sense doesn't quite apply to certain people? I learned that lesson at 22, fresh out of college, when I landed my first real job and met someone who thought she controlled the universe, one email at a time. Hi, I'm Evelyn Clark, though everyone calls me Evie. I had just graduated with a degree in communications, the kind of degree that comes with big dreams and vague career advice like follow your passion and network. Network. I was full of optimism, confidence, and the sort of naive energy that makes you believe the world is fair if you work hard enough. I moved to the city with my little apartment, a laptop, and a head full of ideas. The temp agency job seemed perfect. I'd help people find work, write professional emails, and learn how real offices operate. I imagined friendly coworkers, a mentor guiding me through the maze of corporate life, and maybe, just maybe, some recognition for doing good work. Reality hit fast. From the moment I stepped into the office, I knew this wasn't going to be the cozy environment I'd pictured. The fluorescent lights hummed like they were mocking me. The faint smell of stale coffee lingered in the air, mixed with the soft whirring of printers that sounded like tiny machines plotting their escape. The walls were covered with motivational posters, each one contradicting the other. Teamwork makes the dream work, beside efficiency above all. It was chaotic, cramped, and oddly intimidating, and I loved it. My first day, I met Miss Manager. She was the kind of person who believed her authority was absolute, her intelligence unquestionable, and her taste impeccable. In reality, she had none of those qualities in moderation. She had a talent for micromanaging every single thing in the office, especially emails. No message could leave your desk without her approval. She CC'd herself on everything, from client communications to internal memos. She proofread every outgoing email as if the fate of humanity depended on her commas. And yet she wasn't particularly good at writing herself. Her sentences often twisted in confusing ways. Her commas wandered freely, and she had a knack for turning simple messages into convoluted masterpieces of confusion. I remember watching her hover over a coworker's shoulder one morning, offering corrections that made absolutely no sense. She would insist politely but firmly that a perfectly clear sentence be rewritten, because she knew better. And no one dared say otherwise. Not because they agreed, but because in her mind, she was untouchable. And that's when I realized something critical. In every office, there's always someone like Miss Manager. Someone who craves control so desperately that logic, talent, and reason are optional. Someone who thinks pride and authority outweigh competence. And yet, somewhere beneath that, I also realized something exhilarating. She was human, flawed, and perfectly exploitable if you knew the rules. That first week, I observed, I listened, and I made mental notes. Every habit, every quirk, every tiny obsession. It was like learning a new language, but instead of words, it was people's behavior. I noticed her obsession with taking credit, her overconfidence in proofreading, and her inability to notice mistakes in her own work. And I started thinking, what would happen if someone followed her rules? To the letter, but in a way she never imagined? Little did I know, that question would set the stage for one of the most satisfying experiences of my early career. One simple email, one tiny word, and a perfectly executed plan of malicious compliance would soon transform my world, and quietly, utterly humiliate the woman who thought she ran it. But that story, that moment of strategic brilliance, wouldn't happen immediately. First, I had to learn her weaknesses, study the battlefield, and prepare. Because in this office, victory wasn't about confrontation. It was about patience, precision, and knowing exactly when to strike. And trust me, I struck in a way she never saw coming. If part 1 introduced you to me, Evie, part 2 is where you meet the real star of the office, Miss Manager. And when I say star, I mean the kind of star whose light blinds everyone around them. In the worst possible way. Miss Manager was the kind of person who believed that control equals competence, that her word alone dictated the universe, and that anyone who disagreed simply hadn't been enlightened yet. She had a tiny office, strategically located at the end of the hallway, so she could watch everyone like a hawk. From there, she observed, commented, and intervened, often unnecessarily, always forcefully. Her approach to emails was particularly meticulous. No message could leave without her eyes on it. If a recruiter drafted a simple note to a client, she would read it, pause dramatically, and suggest revisions that made the sentence either confusing, overly formal, or grammatically questionable. Sometimes she would insist on changing words that didn't need changing, like she was auditioning for a role in a bad corporate parody. I quickly realized that she craved recognition above all else. Every positive response from a client, every compliment on a job well done, was automatically her victory. She would casually reply all to claim credit, explaining that since she oversaw all emails, any praise was inherently hers. Meanwhile, the person who actually drafted the email got nothing, not even a polite nod. I saw it happen to my coworkers repeatedly. It was baffling, honestly. She wasn't well-spoken, certainly not a master of prose, and her own writing had glaring errors that she somehow never noticed. Commas wandered like lost tourists, sentences twisted on themselves, and yet she insisted on teaching everyone else. At first I thought maybe it's ignorance, but quickly I realized it was control masquerading as expertise. And the thing about control in an office is that it always creates tension. The moment you remove autonomy from talented people, small rebellions start bubbling quietly under the surface. People whisper. People sigh. People craft tiny acts of passive defiance, like swapping paper clips for no reason, or leaving perfectly innocent comments in emails that read almost like jokes. I started noticing these small cracks almost immediately. One day, a coworker drafted an email that got a genuinely glowing response from a client. Instead of celebrating the team member's success, Miss Manager immediately jumped in. Reply all clicked, and she framed the praise as validation of her oversight. She even explained to the client in her own long-winded way that every outgoing message was reviewed by her because she was responsible for quality control. I watched my coworker's smile fade into a polite nod, unable to reclaim the credit that was rightfully theirs. It was infuriating. But it was also fascinating. I found myself studying her behavior like a researcher observes wildlife. There was a pattern to her micromanagement, a rhythm to her interventions, and a predictability to her need for recognition. Every overcorrection, every unnecessary edit, every reply-all moment was a clue. I filed them all away mentally, knowing that one day this information would be invaluable. And then there were her quirks. Oh, the quirks. She had a habit of hovering, leaning slightly too close over someone's shoulder, and asking, in her sharp, clipped voice, "Are you sure that's correct?" Even when it was perfectly fine. She loved to punctuate her corrections with tiny, almost imperceptible sighs of exasperation. And she had this peculiar way of smiling after she corrected something, like she'd just won a battle in a war that no one else even knew existed. The office adapted around her behaviors, silently. We all learned to navigate the labyrinth of her expectations. Some people developed coping mechanisms. They over-explained everything in emails, double-checked each word, or preemptively CC'd her before even sending a draft. Others became quiet observers, waiting for an opportunity to push back without direct confrontation. And I started plotting. Not in a dramatic way, not immediately. But I noticed, I remembered, and I analyzed, because I knew one day, every obsession, every tiny flaw, and every ridiculous insistence on proofreading would provide an opening. Even her ego was predictable. She believed she was universally respected, universally admired, and universally correct. No amount of polite disagreement, evidence, or logic could shake her belief in her own perfection. But here's the thing about predictable egos. They can be gently guided into traps, if you know what you're doing. And that's exactly what I intended to do. But before I could act, I had to master patience. I had to observe how she interacted with emails, clients, and coworkers. I had to learn the perfect moment when her desire for control would collide with her inability to notice her own mistakes. And most importantly, I had to wait, because rushing would ruin the plan. So I watched, studied, and recorded her behaviors mentally, all while pretending to be the quiet, diligent new recruit. Every unnecessary correction, every tiny demand for credit, every overzealous CC was a puzzle piece. And slowly it started forming a picture, a map of her weaknesses, her pride, and her obsession with authority. By the end of my first month, I had a full mental blueprint of the battlefield. And I knew, without a doubt, that one simple email, phrased perfectly, would soon be enough to quietly, irrevocably, and brilliantly humble her. It all started with a normal Tuesday, or at least what anyone would consider normal in the chaos of a temp agency. My desk was piled with resumes, a half-drunk cup of coffee teetering dangerously near the edge, and my laptop glowing softly with the draft of what I thought was a perfectly professional email. One that could help a candidate land a significant role with one of our agency's most important clients. I leaned back in my chair and read the draft aloud, quietly, so no one else could hear. Based on Jane Doe's past experience, I believe she would be an excellent fit for your open position. Her skills in project management and client relations make her uniquely qualified. Perfect, clear, concise, professional, and entirely truthful, or so I thought. That's when Miss Manager appeared, like a hawk silently descending upon its prey. She leaned over my desk with that signature half-smile, a look that said, "I'm about to teach you something you'll never forget." "Evie," she said, voice clipped but cheerful in that unnerving way, "this email is good, but you've made a small mistake. It should read past experience, not past experience. You need to correct that immediately." I blinked. "Pardon?" She repeated it more firmly this time. "Past experience. I know the difference. It's a common mistake." Now, anyone else might have argued, maybe even gently suggested that past experience is the correct phrase. But I wasn't in the mood for confrontation that morning. Not with her hovering like an eagle ready to swoop down. Instead, I did what I always do when patience is the better part of victory. I obeyed. I typed it exactly as she insisted. Past experience. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a split second longer than usual, savoring the anticipation of the eventual fallout, and, of course, I CC'd her on the email. In the meantime, I watched the office around me. My coworkers were immersed in their own tasks, oblivious to the tiny battle unfolding at my desk. I could almost see them in slow motion, blissfully unaware of the chess game I was setting up with a single word. It was exquisite. There's something to be said about emails. They carry authority, professionalism, and permanence. Unlike a verbal argument, once that email leaves your outbox, it becomes a record, a permanent trace. And in this case, it was a perfectly laid trap. I imagined the client reading it, noticing the error, and sending a polite correction. I imagined Miss Manager reading their reply, feeling the tiniest pang of embarrassment, realizing, subtly but unmistakably, that her overreach had backfired. And I imagined quietly savoring the moment without anyone else suspecting a thing. But for now, all I did was sit. I sipped my coffee, which by now had cooled to a bitter, comforting temperature, and I let the seconds stretch. Patience, after all, was key. One misstep, one premature action, and the entire plan could collapse. And then I thought about the weeks leading up to this. Observing her, learning her patterns, noticing every overcorrection and every small obsession. It had been like studying a very quirky, slightly dangerous species in the wild. She had given me all the tools I needed. Her habits, her ego, her unshakable confidence. I only had to wait for the right moment. And the right moment was now. As she straightened and floated away, satisfied with her correction, I couldn't help but let a tiny smirk play on my lips. She had no idea what was coming. Not yet. I hit save on the draft, leaned back, and let the tension build. I could almost hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, like the world itself was holding its breath. One simple word, a single compliance to an absurd demand, and soon, very soon, the universe would deliver a little poetic justice. In that moment, I felt a surge of anticipation mixed with amusement. This wasn't just about an email. It was about strategy, observation, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that patience often beats confrontation. And if I executed this perfectly, Miss Manager, so obsessed with control, would have no one to blame but herself. Little did she know, She had just handed me the perfect setup for one of the most satisfying moments of my early career. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to stretch and contract in the office as I waited for the inevitable. Every little ding of the inbox felt like a drum roll, and then finally, it arrived. A reply from the client. I clicked it open, my fingers poised like a pianist ready to strike the final chord in a symphony. And there it was, sitting in perfect professional clarity. Dear Evie, as someone who hires people to work on printed literature, we noticed a small error in your email. It should read past experience, not past experience. Just wanted to let you know. Thank you, I paused. Read it again, smiled, and then quietly, without anyone noticing, I let a small victorious chuckle escape. I could already feel the gears turning in my mind. This was it. The moment of malicious compliance I had been waiting for. I leaned back in my chair and thought about the situation. Miss Manager had insisted on past experience. I had complied, perfectly, and now the client had corrected it. And because she had insisted, she could not deny responsibility. Her own rules had set the trap, and now it was time to let the dominoes fall. I opened a new reply, all recipients included, CCing Miss Manager, of course, and began typing. I chose my words with surgical precision, crafting a message that was polite, professional, and subtly devastating. Thank you so much for your feedback. Miss Manager values all feedback extremely highly. In fact, since she proofreads all outgoing emails, she was the one who insisted that it read past experience. I'm sure she'll be thrilled to hear your thoughts. I paused before hitting send, savoring the moment like a chef about to present the pièce de résistance. Then, with a gentle click, it went out, and I waited. Miss Manager was the first to notice. I saw her glance at her inbox, open the reply all, and pause mid-scroll. Her face, normally confident and sharp, changed slowly. First came confusion, then a flash of realization, and finally a subtle, creeping horror. She had been caught, and she knew it. I couldn't see exactly what she was thinking, but the look in her eyes was unmistakable. Every instinct, every ego-driven impulse she had relied on, was being held against her in one elegant, invisible mirror. Around the office, the subtle ripples of the event began. I noticed coworkers glancing at her screen, eyebrows raised. Some pretended not to notice. Others stifled quiet chuckles. No one needed to say a word. The shift had happened. The power dynamics had changed, just slightly but significantly. Miss Manager's reaction was almost cinematic. She sat frozen, reading and rereading the message, as though replaying it might somehow make the situation vanish. I watched her fumble subtly with her chair, clearing her throat nervously, and realizing she could no longer claim the perfection she had so aggressively displayed just hours ago. And then came the announcement. The very next morning, she called a staff meeting. Everyone shuffled into the conference room, curious. We all knew something had shifted, but none of us could predict how she would address it. I no longer want to proofread outgoing emails, she said, her voice a little higher than usual. You don't need to CC me anymore. The room went silent for a beat. And I, naturally, had to bite my lip to keep from smiling too widely. Victory was sweet, but quiet, elegant. It didn't need applause. I reflected on the subtle genius of the situation. Miss Manager had given me the perfect tool, her insistence on control and her need to be CC'd on everything. By following her rules exactly as laid out, I had turned her obsession into a trap of her own making. It was compliance, but not just any compliance. It was malicious, strategic, and devastatingly satisfying. That day, I felt a small thrill, a mix of pride and amusement. This was a lesson I would carry for life. Sometimes the key to winning isn't confrontation. It's observation, patience, and understanding human behavior well enough to let the universe, or a cleverly worded email, deliver justice for you. Even as coworkers whispered, smirked, or exchanged subtle glances, I knew the truth. This was more than an office victory. It was a personal lesson in strategy, timing, and the quiet satisfaction of being smarter than the person who thinks they know it all. And in that moment, I realized something even more valuable. Every tiny act of patience, every observation, every subtle note about someone's habits, could eventually be used to craft a perfect, elegant solution to a problem. Sometimes winning isn't about being loud or aggressive. Sometimes it's about silently, brilliantly following the rules in a way nobody expects. And if you think this was the end, this was just the beginning. The fallout, the subtle changes in the office, and the quiet ripple effects of that single email would continue for weeks, teaching lessons far beyond grammar and micromanagement. But that story, that comes next. The day after the infamous reply all email, the office felt different. It wasn't loud or dramatic. No confetti, no fanfare. But there was a subtle shift in the air. You could almost feel the tension loosen, like a taut string finally giving way, leaving behind a quiet sense of relief. Miss Manager arrived at her desk, her posture slightly more rigid than usual. She didn't make eye contact as freely, didn't hover over every draft, and, most tellingly, she didn't open her inbox with that triumphant little smirk she normally wore. Something had changed. She no longer had the invisible crown of absolute control. Meanwhile, my coworkers started acting differently too. They weren't openly celebratory. That would have been dangerous. But the energy shifted. There were tiny acts of rebellion. Someone left an email in draft longer than necessary. Another person dared to skip a needless CC, and someone else quietly corrected a comma without fear of immediate scrutiny. The office finally began to breathe. I watched all of this from my desk, quietly noting the subtle victories. It was funny to see how quickly habits had formed and reformed around a single, perfectly executed email. Miss Manager had been humbled, but no one needed to point it out. Everyone just knew. Even the interns seemed to sense the change. They were tentative at first, new to the office hierarchy and careful not to upset the delicate balance. But slowly, they started to observe what was possible. How rules could be followed to the letter. How patience and strategy could bend even the most overbearing authority without confrontation. I smiled, remembering my own first week. There's a certain joy in knowing the next generation is learning the subtle art of influence without them even realizing it. The ripple effects didn't stop there. I noticed small changes in Miss Manager's behavior over the weeks. She still corrected emails occasionally, but her insistence had softened. She no longer demanded CCs on everything, and she seemed to measure her words more carefully before sending out instructions. It was fascinating. Even a tiny crack in her armor had shifted her approach, subtly, permanently. For me, it wasn't just about winning a battle over one email. It was about learning how power works in the workplace. I realized that authority can often be more fragile than it appears, and that observation, patience, and strategic action often speak louder than confrontation or anger. I also began to reflect on the humor of the situation. All of it, really. The absurdity of an entire office's dynamics hinging on a single word, the way Miss Manager so confidently insisted she was right, and the poetic justice of her own rules being used against her. It was almost like watching a slow-motion comedy, where the punchline finally lands hours after the setup. Even now, years later, I can replay that moment in my mind with perfect clarity. The exact phrasing of my reply all email, the subtle shift in Miss Manager's expression as she read it, the almost imperceptible changes in office behavior the following days. Every tiny detail reinforced one truth. Strategy, patience, and clever observation often outpace force or argument. I started documenting the lessons I had learned. Not in a notebook, not formally, but mentally. Things like observe first, act second. Authority often overestimates its own strength. Rules can be your greatest ally if you follow them flawlessly. Humor and subtlety can disarm tension better than confrontation. Small victories accumulate into lasting influence. It was funny, because at the time I thought the email was just a small act of compliance, an obedience to an absurd demand. But it became a catalyst for learning how people operate, how influence spreads, and how quiet, thoughtful action can shape outcomes far beyond what anyone expects. My coworkers, too, learned. They became a little bolder, a little more observant, and a lot more careful with overzealous managers. They whispered jokes about past versus past, shared subtle smirks, and built camaraderie around the shared experience. Even the office culture improved. incrementally but noticeably. People were more aware of the absurdity in rigid hierarchies, and they learned to navigate it gracefully. And me? I felt like a general surveying a battlefield after a subtle yet complete victory. No one else had seen it coming. Miss Manager had been outmaneuvered, not with aggression, but with precision, patience, and clever strategy. It was a lesson I would carry with me for every future office, every future team, and every challenge that required subtle cunning instead of brute force. It's funny how a single word, past versus past, could create such a domino effect. Who knew that grammar could be so powerful? Who knew that following instructions to the letter, when done with strategy, could be both satisfying and transformative? It was a small battle, yes, but the lessons were enormous, and as I sat at my desk, sipping now cold coffee and watching the office continue its subtle shift, I realized something important. Victory doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's elegant, and sometimes it's delivered one perfectly chosen word at a time. Looking back on that first year at the temp agency, I can laugh at how a single word, past, instead of past, could create such a ripple effect. At the time, it felt like just another tedious Tuesday, another tiny battle in the endless war of office politics, but in hindsight it became so much more. That one carefully crafted email taught me lessons that went far beyond grammar or compliance. The first lesson was about patience. Watching Miss Manager, studying her habits, and waiting for the perfect moment to act was difficult. I wanted to intervene immediately, to correct her, to point out the obvious mistake, but I knew that timing mattered. True victories aren't rushed. They're earned by waiting, observing, and acting at precisely the right moment. Second, I learned the power of strategic compliance. It sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? Following the rules to the letter to create an outcome that actually teaches a lesson, but it works. By letting her insist on past experience, I didn't break a single rule. I didn't argue. I simply allowed her own obsession to undo her authority. And the result was far more satisfying than confrontation ever could have been. Third, I realized that ego can be the easiest thing to manipulate if you know how it works. Miss Manager was confident, overly proud, and convinced she was always right. But that confidence became her weakness. The very traits that made her a nightmare to work under, her need to control, her obsession with credit, her insistence on perfection, also provided the key to quiet, clever retribution. Sometimes, understanding human behavior and subtle psychology is more powerful than any formal skill or training. And finally, I learned the beauty of small victories. They don't always come with fireworks. They don't need applause or acknowledgement. But the satisfaction of watching someone realize they've overreached, of knowing that your patience and strategy created a moment of justice, is incredibly fulfilling. Victory can be quiet, elegant, and profoundly satisfying. I carried these lessons with me to every future role, every office, every team. They shaped how I approached challenges, how I interacted with authority figures, and how I assessed situations where rules, ego, and behavior intersect. I became a little more observant, a little more patient, and a lot more strategic. I realized that the workplace isn't just about doing your job. It's about navigating people, understanding dynamics, and sometimes letting the universe, or a cleverly worded email, deliver justice in its own way. And here's a truth that applies far beyond the office. Life often rewards the patient, the clever, and those willing to observe before acting. Not everyone will notice, and not everyone will applaud, but the impact will be there. Subtlety can be one of your greatest strengths. Humor, strategy, and patience can be far more effective than anger or rash decisions. I sometimes imagine Miss Manager, years later, thinking back to that email, and perhaps finally understanding the lesson she unknowingly delivered. It's a funny thought, one that makes me grin. She was untouchable in her mind. But the reality is that even the most confident ego can be quietly humbled, one perfectly executed step at a time. For me, this story isn't just about revenge or proving someone wrong. It's about strategy, observation, patience, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the most effective action is to play the long game, to follow the rules but with precision, to act subtly yet decisively, to let small actions build toward a larger impact. And if there's one takeaway I want you to have from this story, it's this. Never underestimate the power of patience, observation, and strategic thinking. Even the smallest details, like a single word in an email, can have a massive impact if used wisely. If this story made you smile, if you love satisfying tales of clever strategy, office drama, or just a little poetic justice, there's plenty more where this came from. I share stories like this every week. Stories that are funny, shocking, and sometimes downright unbelievable. So don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join our storytelling family. I promise you, the next story is going to be just as thrilling, clever, and satisfying as this one. Trust me, you won't want to miss it, because sometimes the best victories are the ones you watch unfold quietly, strategically, and with perfect timing.